From the very beginning, Call of Duty World War II Zombies was positioned not as a continuation, but as a correction. An intentional pivot away from what zombies had slowly become over the years. And understanding what happened to this mode later requires first understanding what it was trying to be at its inception. By 2017, Zombies as a sub-mode carried an enormous legacy, but also a growing problem. It was loud, colorful, increasingly mechanical, and buried beneath years of self-referential lore that rewarded veterans while quietly alienating everyone else. Sledgehammer Games did not inherit Zombies as a blank canvas. They inherited it as a towering structure built by Treyarch, defined by perk jingles, power fantasies, circular map flow, and an escalating mythology that leaned closer to comic book spectacle than horror. World War II Zombies was conceived in direct opposition to that trajectory. Its vision was rooted in restraint. Where previous entries embraced excess, World War II Zombies wanted austerity. Where other modes leaned into empowerment, this one leaned into vulnerability. And where zombies had become familiar, even comforting, this mode wanted to be deeply uncomfortable. The choice of World War II as a backdrop was not incidental. Sledgehammer didn't see the setting as nostalgia, but as grounding. Real-world history, real-world suffering, and a visual language tied to mud, steel, and decay allowed the mode to reclaim something zombies had slowly lost: dread. This wasn't about neon perks or heroic one-liners. It was about cold laboratories, flickering lights, and the suggestion that what you were uncovering should never have been unearthed. Even before a single mechanic is discussed, the tone makes its intentions clear. The opening cinematic doesn't invite the player in, it warns them. There is no sense of playful mystery here, only violation and consequence. The undead are not a joke, not a spectacle, but a byproduct of human cruelty and obsession. This framing matters, because it informs every design decision that follows, from enemy presentation to progression systems, and ultimately explains why the mode felt so different and why that difference would later become both its strength and its undoing. At its core, World War II Zombies was attempting to reset the emotional contract between player and game. Instead of asking players to master systems for the sake of dominance, it asked them to survive an experience. Armor replaced passive perk reliance, not as a gimmick, but as a statement. You are fragile here. Loadouts were introduced not simply to offer customization, but to establish preparedness as a thematic concept, reinforcing the idea that you were entering something dangerous with limited tools and uncertain outcomes. Even the absence of traditional perk machines at launch wasn't a rejection of Zombies' history, but an effort to strip the experience down to something more primal. This was Zombies through a survival horror lens, where every system was meant to remind the player that power came at a cost, and safety was temporary at best. What's crucial to understand is that this vision wasn't naive. It was deliberate, almost defiant. Sledgehammer knew they would be compared to Treyarch, and instead of competing on scale or complexity, they chose mood, pacing, and thematic cohesion. The goal was not to outdo classic Zombies, but to interrogate it, to ask what the mode could feel like if it remembered its roots in fear rather than spectacle. In doing so, World War II Zombies positioned itself as an alternative path for the franchise, one that could coexist rather than compete, offering something darker and more intimate for players who felt disconnected from the increasingly convoluted direction Zombies had taken. But embedded within this vision was a quiet tension that would define everything that followed. By rejecting familiarity, World War II Zombies also rejected comfort. By narrowing its emotional focus, it risked narrowing its audience. And by grounding its horror so firmly in atmosphere and tone, it created expectations that would be increasingly difficult to sustain as the mode expanded. The promise was clear: a return to horror, to vulnerability, to meaning. Yet that promise came with a fragile balance, one that required every future map, mechanic, and narrative beat to reinforce the same identity without slipping back into excess or drifting into confusion. As we move forward, the story of what happened to World War II Zombies becomes less about whether this vision was good or bad, and more about what happens when a bold reinvention collides with long-term engagement. evolving systems, and a community shaped by very different expectations. When Call of Duty World War II Zombies finally reached players, the immediate reaction was not confusion or rejection, but unease. And that distinction matters. The mode did not arrive quietly. It arrived with a sense of intrusion, as if players had stepped into something they were not meant to see. The final Reich, the launch map, functioned less like a playground and more like a threshold. From the first moments, everything reinforced the original vision: the muted color palette, the oppressive architecture, the way sound design favored distant screams and mechanical groans over music or rhythm. Even basic navigation felt tense, corridors narrowing just enough to make retreat uncomfortable, sightlines deliberately obstructed to prevent players from ever feeling fully in control. This was not zombies as a power fantasy. It was zombies as sustained anxiety, and for many players, that difference was immediately striking. Early impressions reflected this tonal shift. Longtime Zombies fans recognized that something fundamental had changed, not mechanically at first, but emotionally. The absence of familiar audio cues, the lack of exaggerated character banter, and the restrained presentation of objectives created a slower, heavier pace. Players spoke less about strategies and more about atmosphere, about how the game made them feel rather than how efficiently they could exploit it. For a brief moment, World War II Zombies succeeded in reframing the conversation. The community wasn't debating optimal perk paths or Easter egg steps. They were reacting viscerally to imagery, to the grotesque designs of enemies that felt less like caricatures and more like distorted remains of people. The zombies moved with weight. Their presence felt intrusive rather than routine, and that alone made the experience feel alien compared to what had come before. Yet embedded within that initial shock was a fragile optimism. Many players interpreted the grounded tone as a promise, a suggestion that this mode would slowly unfold its mysteries rather than overwhelm them. The narrative breadcrumbs scattered throughout the final Reich hinted at something contained, something deliberate, rooted in experimentation and moral decay rather than cosmic inevitability. This restraint resonated strongly at launch, particularly among players who had grown fatigued with the escalating absurdity of prior Zombies storylines. For them, World War II Zombies felt like a reset, not just in mechanics, but in intent. It asked players to pay attention again, to absorb environment and implication, instead of chasing spectacle. That sense of discovery carried the mode through its early weeks, buoyed by the belief that this darker direction would remain consistent as the experience expanded. However, even in those early days, subtle fractures began to form. While atmosphere earned praise, discussions around replayability surfaced almost immediately. The slower pacing that enhanced tension also reduced momentum. And once the initial dread faded, players began engaging with the mode on more mechanical terms. Without the emotional novelty, questions emerged about depth, longevity, and mastery. Armor systems, loadouts, and progression mechanics were still new enough to feel intriguing. But they also introduced a different kind of friction, one that demanded planning over improvisation. For some, this reinforced immersion. For others, it created distance. The very systems designed to ground the experience began revealing how much the mode relied on mood to carry engagement. Community reaction, then, became divided not along lines of quality, but along expectations. Players who embraced the horror-first identity praised the commitment to tone and restraint, seeing the final Reich as a foundation rather than a culmination. Meanwhile, players accustomed to zombies as a repeatable, escalating loop began to sense limitations. The map was meticulously crafted, but it was also rigid, its secrets finite, its surprises eventually exhausted. As the weeks passed, discussion shifted from atmosphere to sustainability, from fear to familiarity. The shock value that had initially defined World War II Zombies proved powerful but fleeting. And without constant escalation or novelty, the mode began to feel static to those seeking long-term progression. This transition in perception is crucial, because it marks the moment where World War II Zombies stopped being judged on what it was and started being judged on what it could become. The launch succeeded in delivering on its promise of reinvention, but it also exposed the inherent challenge of that promise. Horror thrives on the unknown, yet live service expectations demand repetition. Atmosphere can carry a first impression, but systems must sustain engagement over time. As the initial fear settled into routine, the tension between vision and longevity became unavoidable. World War II Zombies had captured attention, but now it faced a more difficult task, evolving without betraying its identity. And it is within that tension that the mode's deeper struggles would begin to surface, shaping the decisions that followed, and setting the stage for the gradual erosion of the experience that once felt so deliberate and controlled. As the initial shock of World War II Zombies began to fade, what remained was the machinery beneath the atmosphere, and it was here that the mode's most consequential problems quietly emerged. This was not a sudden collapse, nor a dramatic rejection by the community, but a gradual shift in how players interacted with the experience once fear was no longer the primary driver. Horror, by nature, is fragile. It depends on uncertainty, on the illusion that the player is never fully in control. But Zombies, as a long-term mode, depends on mastery, repetition, and the pleasure of optimization. World War II Zombies attempted to reconcile these two opposing needs, and in doing so, it created systems that felt thematically coherent but mechanically conflicted. The armor system is the clearest example of this tension. On paper, it reinforced vulnerability, requiring players to actively maintain their defenses rather than relying on passive buffs. In practice, however, armor shifted the rhythm of survival into a loop of maintenance rather than escalation. Instead of building toward empowerment, players found themselves locked into a cycle of resource management that rarely evolved. The fear of being overwhelmed was replaced by the frustration of attrition, and over time, that distinction mattered. What initially felt immersive began to feel restrictive, especially in higher rounds where survival hinged less on skillful movement or improvisation and more on whether systems had been properly serviced. Loadouts and progression systems followed a similar pattern. While intended to give players agency before the match even began, they subtly reduced the sense of discovery that had long defined Zombies. Earlier iterations forced players to adapt to the map, to learn its layout organically and respond to its limitations. World War II Zombies, by contrast, encouraged premeditation. This shift wasn't inherently flawed, but it altered the emotional texture of the experience. The unknown became manageable too quickly, and once players understood the optimal setups, experimentation gave way to routine. The maps were still oppressive, still visually unsettling, but mechanically, they became predictable. And predictability is the enemy of sustained horror. This predictability extended into enemy behavior and encounter design. The grotesque enemy types that initially shocked players soon revealed themselves as variations on familiar patterns. And without constant remixing or mechanical surprises, their impact diminished. What once felt invasive became procedural. The game still demanded attention, but it no longer demanded fear. Players began to approach encounters analytically, calculating efficiency rather than reacting instinctively. In doing so, World War II Zombies drifted closer to the very design philosophy it had originally sought to escape, albeit without the spectacle or humor that had traditionally softened that transition. Community discussions increasingly reflected this shift. Early praise for atmosphere gave way to critiques of pacing and replayability. Players didn't reject the systems outright, but they questioned their longevity. The mode felt dense but shallow, intense but rigid. Attempts to preserve tension through limitation often resulted in reduced player expression. And as mastery set in, there was little left to uncover beyond incremental optimization. This wasn't a failure of design, so much as a consequence of intent. World War II Zombies had been built to be endured, not exploited. And that distinction became increasingly problematic as players sought reasons to return week after week. What's important here is that these cracks did not immediately fracture the experience. They accumulated slowly, subtly altering how the mode was perceived. Each system, when examined in isolation, made sense within the original vision, But together, they created an ecosystem that struggled to evolve. Expansion required either deepening these systems or abandoning their original restraint, and both options carried risk. To deepen them would mean adding complexity that might dilute the horror. To abandon them would mean betraying the identity that defined the mode at launch. This dilemma sat at the heart of World War II Zombies design, unresolved and increasingly visible as new content loomed. By the time additional maps and updates began to roll out, the foundation had already begun to strain. The atmosphere still lingered, but it was no longer enough to mask mechanical stagnation. Players were no longer asking how the game made them feel. They were asking how much it had left to offer. And in a mode built so heavily on first impressions and thematic cohesion, that question carried dangerous implications. To sustain engagement, World War II Zombies would need to grow, to escalate, to surprise again. But growth, as the next chapter reveals, would come at a cost. And the attempt to expand the experience would slowly pull it away from the very identity that once made it feel so distinct. As World War II Zombies moved beyond its launch window, the most significant transformation did not occur in mechanics or presentation, but in narrative ambition, and it is here that the mode began to quietly unravel its own identity. The early story of World War II Zombies was effective precisely because of what it withheld. It framed horror as consequence rather than spectacle, grounding its mysteries in human cruelty, obsession, and experimentation. The undead were not symbols of cosmic imbalance or metaphysical corruption, they were evidence. Evidence of a world that had gone too far in its pursuit of control, power, and victory. This restraint aligned perfectly with the oppressive tone of the maps and the vulnerability of the player. But restraint, especially in a long-running franchise, is difficult to sustain. As new maps were introduced, the narrative began to expand, not inward, but outward, and in doing so, it shifted from psychological horror toward mythological excess. The escalation was subtle at first. New locations introduced new factions, deeper conspiracies, and increasingly elaborate explanations for the horrors players were facing. What had once felt like a contained nightmare began to stretch across continents and timelines. The problem was not complexity itself, but direction. Instead of deepening the emotional core established in the Final Reich, the story began layering mythology on top of it, introducing abstract concepts that demanded exposition rather than observation. Cutscenes grew more elaborate, stakes more grandiose, and antagonists more symbolic than tangible. In isolation, these developments were not poorly executed, but they clashed with the grounded horror that had originally defined the mode. The experience was no longer about uncovering something forbidden. It was about understanding something convoluted. This narrative expansion created a disconnect between story and play. The environments remained grim and oppressive, but the story they were now meant to support felt increasingly detached from that atmosphere. The horror became theatrical rather than intimate, driven by revelation instead of implication. Players were no longer piecing together meaning through environment and implication. They were being told what mattered and why. This shift eroded one of the mode's greatest strengths, its ability to let silence, decay, and ambiguity speak for themselves. As lore took center stage, atmosphere was forced into a supporting role, and the balance that once made World War II Zombies feel cohesive began to fracture. Community reaction mirrored this change. Players who had embraced the early narrative restraint began to express fatigue. Not with the story itself, but with how aggressively it demanded attention. The more the narrative expanded, the more it resembled the very zombie storytelling philosophy that World War II Zombies had initially rejected. Elaborate mythologies returned, symbolism became literal, and mystery gave way to explanation. For players who had hoped this mode would remain an alternative to that approach, the shift felt like a betrayal of intent. Meanwhile, players who enjoyed complex lore found the execution uneven. Caught between the grounded horror of the presentation and the increasingly abstract nature of the story being told. This overreach also exacerbated existing mechanical issues. As the narrative grew larger, the gameplay struggled to evolve in meaningful ways that supported it. New enemies and objectives were introduced, but they often felt like narrative necessities rather than organic extensions of play. Encounters became more scripted, less emergent, and in a mode already criticized for rigidity, this further reduced player agency. Instead of discovering horror, players were now being guided through it. And that distinction fundamentally altered how the experience felt. The sense of being trapped in a hostile environment was replaced by the sense of participating in a predetermined sequence of events. By attempting to elevate the story to match the scale of its predecessors, World War II Zombies sacrificed the intimacy that made it compelling. The horror became louder, the stakes higher, but the emotional resonance weaker. What began as a study of human darkness transformed into a tapestry of mythological conflict, and in doing so, it lost its thematic anchor. This was not a failure of creativity, but of alignment. The narrative no longer served the experience. The experience was bending to accommodate the narrative. As this shift solidified, World War II Zombies found itself in an uncomfortable position. It had moved too far from its original vision to fully reclaim it. Yet not far enough to compete directly with the spectacle-driven zombies modes it had sought to differentiate itself from. The result was an identity crisis, one that left the mode feeling caught between two philosophies, unable to fully commit to either. And as players drifted away, not out of outrage, but out of disconnection, the question was no longer what World War II Zombies was trying to say, but whether it still knew who it was talking to. The consequences of that uncertainty would become fully apparent only in retrospect. As the mode faded from prominence, leaving behind a legacy defined not by collapse, but by a quiet erosion of purpose. By the time World War II Zombies had fully expanded through its life cycle, the mode had already begun to occupy a peculiar space in the minds of its audience. It was no longer the shocking, grounded reinvention that had initially captured attention. Yet it had never fully returned to the playful, spectacle-driven loops that defined classic zombies. Its identity, once deliberate and compelling, had become diluted by a series of compromises between narrative ambition, mechanical experimentation, and community expectation. What emerged in the aftermath was a mode that was both respected and quietly neglected. A paradoxical state that made understanding its fate essential for anyone interested in the evolution of the franchise and the delicate balance between vision and sustainability. In retrospect, the story of World War II Zombies is less about a failure of creativity than about the inherent tension between horror as a lived experience and zombies as a repeatable game system. These forces, once aligned in a careful equilibrium, had drifted apart, leaving behind a mode that was simultaneously innovative and unsustainable. The first consequence was evident in community engagement. Initial excitement had given way to a slow attrition of players. Those drawn to the dark, oppressive atmosphere had long since exhausted the small set of launch maps, while those seeking deeper lore or more complex systems had encountered narrative overreach that was rewarding in exposition, but limited in interactivity. Without a rhythm that balanced fear, challenge, and progression, retention suffered. Forums and social media were filled with discussions that were at once analytical and nostalgic, comparing the ambition of World War II Zombies to the mechanics and pacing of Treyarch's Zombies modes, often concluding that Sledgehammer had succeeded in creating something unique, but not something enduring. The mode, it seemed, was destined to be remembered fondly by a niche audience while failing to capture a long-term mainstream following. Mechanically, the mode had also exposed the limitations of its experimental systems. Armor loadouts and a focus on survival tension had created an experience that was initially compelling. But once the novelty faded, these same systems became friction. Progression felt slower, encounters less dynamic, and the sense of empowerment that many players expected from a zombies mode was constrained by design choices that prioritized thematic consistency over replayability. Updates attempted to mitigate these weaknesses, introducing new maps, enemies, and story beats. But the underlying tension between survival horror and repeatable fun remained unresolved. Each new addition, while mechanically and narratively polished, risked highlighting the limitations of what had come before, rather than building on them. In other words, the mode's strengths also became its weaknesses, and this duality defined its trajectory toward obsolescence. The narrative overreach, which at one point seemed like an expansion of creative ambition, ultimately contributed to the mode's fading relevance. By shifting from intimate, human-centered horror to sprawling mythological complexity, World War II Zombies inadvertently alienated the very players who had embraced its grounded beginnings. The story was now more concerned with exposition and the expansion of lore than with maintaining a coherent emotional throughline. Horror, which thrives on ambiguity, subtlety, and the unknown, had been replaced by explanation and spectacle. This transition undermined the emotional resonance that had made the mode compelling, leaving players less invested in survival and more in deciphering a sprawling mythology that did not naturally lend itself to interactive engagement. As a result, the emotional investment that had anchored early adoption dissipated, replaced by a growing awareness of the mode's limitations. Yet the story of World War II Zombies does not end with disengagement or neglect. In many ways, the mode left a quiet legacy that persists in the franchise and among its players. It demonstrated that zombies could be approached differently, that horror could be grounded in atmosphere and consequence rather than power fantasies and spectacle. It showed that restraint, vulnerability, and deliberate pacing could create moments of tension and dread unmatched by more traditional entries. Even as its popularity waned, these lessons were absorbed into the broader discourse around zombies' design, influencing how later iterations approached the balance between narrative, atmosphere, and mechanics. Players and designers alike recognized the ambition, even if the execution ultimately limited its longevity. The Final Reich, once a simple map, became emblematic of what zombies could be when it prioritized mood over mechanics, horror over spectacle, and intention over repetition. This quiet influence is perhaps the most compelling aspect of the aftermath. World War II Zombies did not collapse spectacularly. It faded gradually, leaving behind a template for what alternative approaches could look like. Designers could see the potential in systems like armor and loadouts, and how grounded horror could coexist with progression, while players began to appreciate that there was value in an experience that challenged them emotionally rather than mechanically. In hindsight, the mode functioned as a bridge. It connected the past, defined by Treyarch's intricate and often playful mythologies, to a potential future where tone, atmosphere, and human-centered horror could once again take center stage. The tension that had ultimately undermined engagement was the same tension that offered lessons for the evolution of the mode and the franchise at large. World War II Zombies' fading popularity also illuminated the fickle nature of franchise expectations. Players approached each new map with a blend of anticipation and comparison, measuring the experience not only against previous entries but against the vision established at launch. This dual standard created pressure for Sledgehammer to deliver both fidelity to the initial tone and sufficient evolution to retain engagement. Where other zombies modes could rely on spectacle and repetition, World War II Zombies demanded subtlety, discipline, and consistent thematic cohesion qualities that, while admirable, are inherently harder to sustain in a live service model. The result was a slow drift. An audience initially captivated by novelty, gradually replaced by those seeking more conventional zombies loops, leaving the mode in a niche yet respected position. Ultimately, the aftermath of World War II Zombies is defined by contrast and reflection. It highlights the tension between bold creative vision and long-term playability, between narrative ambition and mechanical engagement, between horror as experience and zombies as a repeatable system. The mode failed to maintain a mass audience not because it lacked quality or innovation, but because it dared to be different, to prioritize emotional resonance over conventional reward loops. Its legacy is quiet, understated, and easily overlooked, yet it remains important. It serves as both a cautionary tale and a blueprint, a reminder that innovation requires balance, that engagement depends as much on mechanics as on tone, and that ambition, while commendable, must always negotiate with the expectations of an established audience. World War II Zombies faded not with a crash, but with a quiet dignity, leaving behind lessons for designers, memories for players, and a space within the franchise for experimentation that might one day again challenge what it means to survive the undead.